All right, this first section of notes of this unit are dealing with a bunch of concepts. I've titled it The Concepts of Culture, and you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see your essential question pop up. I'm going to start putting it there rather than in here. The first thing that we're looking at are cultural traits. And what you're going to notice is these headings go pretty close to your actual curriculum in the first couple parts of your curriculum. So we're going to be identifying these concepts and how they deal with culture. The first is cultural traits. Cultural traits are dealing with single attributes about a culture. Okay, it's a single attribute that what we're looking for. It's not necessarily confined to one single culture, but a cultural trait is like one attribute that we're looking at within that culture. The trait can then combine all of these, or you can combine all of these different distinctive traits, and that gives you the cultural complex. It's not a sickness, but the cultural complex is then dealing with the whole element of culture. And the definition of culture that I want you to remember is a complex mix of values, beliefs, behaviors, and norms for material objects that together form a people's way of life. There's a lot of different things that come together and make culture. Now, the first element that we're going to be looking at are the non-material elements of culture. These are your values, beliefs, behaviors, and norms. One thing before I forget to identify is that cultural ecology fits within cultural traits, and sometimes we disregard this. Cultural ecology, I'll get it eventually, is dealing with how people are coming into contact with the environment. It's the relationship between human society and the environment, and the cultural ecology is going to change the makeup of the culture. In other words, the things of the environment around an area are going to come into contact with the culture and mix and adapt and change that culture depending on what's around. Okay, your values are things that are defined standards that guide people within the society. Defined standards. Your beliefs are the specific statements that people look at in regards to their culture. The behaviors are the actions that people take in regards to their culture, and the norms are the values and the beliefs. The norms are your rules and expectations, just like we have in class. These are the things that are expected of you in the culture. There's also material elements of a culture. These are things like artifacts, relics, and art. These are the actual material things. Non-material things are kind of like your ideas. Your material things are your material types of cultures. These can reflect these, because these non-materials are going to change the material culture that you actually see. The next major concept of culture that we're going to be looking at is diffusion patterns. Now, these are a review from earlier units, but we're going to apply them to culture. And I don't want you to forget about them. There's expansion diffusion and relocation diffusion. Expansion diffusion is talking about when the culture diffuses or spreads and how it spreads and expands. That's what we're looking for in this type of diffusion. Remember, contagious diffusion is like everybody in the immediate area is affected. It's contagious. So that culture just spreads in the immediate area. Okay, it's not discriminative, it just goes. The hierarchical diffusion is, it doesn't spread openly. Within people groups, it spreads. And you can also apply the distance decay formula and say, the further you are away from this culture, the less likely it is that you're going to come into contact with it. But again, this is specific people groups that spreads the culture. There's stimulus diffusion, which you take a certain element of that culture and spread. And then the relocation diffusion is like the idea of migrants and how they are actually relocating their diffusion. So the spread kind of picks up and moves somewhere else and hence relocates. And then once it gets to that other place, then we can look at the expansion diffusion. Now, your next concepts of culture that we're going to be looking at are acculturation, assimilation. It's kind of been erased, but you can see it here. And then multiculturalism, which it's also going to be known as transculturation. It's the same thing. Now, the first of acculturation, this is dealing with when a culture comes into contact with another culture. One of those cultures oftentimes starts to dominate the other. Domination begins. So my definition here is we have contact with other cultures and the domination begins. This is the idea like when a people group immigrate to a nation, they start to change and their elements start to change. And parts of that other culture start to dominate and kind of erase and take over parts of their own culture. So maybe we're looking at food, because I like food. If you go, like let's say the Asian peoples leave Asia and come to New England, into the United States. Okay, they get to those areas and they are introduced to things like hot dogs and hamburgers. Maybe that people group from Asia start to eat that type of food more so than their own types of food. So the idea of the food culture is being acculturated because parts of that idea of eating Asian food is now disappearing. Okay, it's no longer their favorite. And that's just one element, so it's starting to dominate. And you're going to see that domination as we come down. The next is what we're looking at is assimilation. Assimilation is total domination. So the kids or the grandparents of these immigrants, now in the United States, generations later, their culture of Asia is basically dominated and wiped out, and what you see is the culture of America, if that's what we're talking about. This is also known as cultural imperialism, kind of a takeover of a culture. But it's, again, it takes several generations, and it's when your culture is totally dominated. An enclave is an example of this. What an enclave means is that's when you're totally surrounded by something. So assimilation will take place essentially in an enclave because that culture is totally surrounded and you don't have your other elements of culture. You're not surrounded by other Asians in Asia, so it starts to be dominated because you're in an enclave, because you're surrounded, you're isolated within this other culture, and this culture starts to dominate. Okay? The next is multiculturalism, and this is also known as transculturation. This is when the culture can't dominate. What this means is, like with Buddhism originated in India, and then it spreads into other parts of the world, and the other parts of Asia that it spreads to, Confucianism is also really high in the religious world, and it's one of their dominant cultures. And Buddhism and Confucianism don't cancel each other out in those cultures. Parts of their other cultures do, but there's multiculturalism going on because people are still worshiping Buddhism, and then in the same area you also have people worshiping Confucianism because those two ideas are big enough to where they won't dominate each other, where one won't dominate the other. And that's kind of the example that we look at, a good example of multiculturalism. It's when the domination won't occur. Okay, your next concepts that we're looking at are cultural region, vernacular region, and cultural hearth. What we're looking at with cultural region is this is a study of an area where a culture is, where it exists. The idea is that this area is marked by a culture by distinguishing characteristics that make up a culture in a specific geographical area. That's what we're looking at by cultural region. So different cultural regions like East Asia have different elements of culture versus South Asia. Okay, it's areas, geographic areas that make up a region. Vernacular region, what you can kind of keep in mind with vernacular is the same thing as perceptual. A perceptual region is one that's based off of opinions and ideas and can't be proven. Same thing with vernacular region. It can be proven. It's based off of opinions and ideas. It's the idea that things exist. That's when people believe that something exists in an area. You can't necessarily prove it, but it gives sense to a place. It allows people to think about a place differently. Some examples are like the Sun Belt in the United States. The Sun Belt is an area of southern and also southwestern United States. It's this idea that the climate is kind of mild, that people like to live here because it's moderate temperatures, those sorts of things. But we can't prove where the Sun Belt is. People just have an idea about it. And what you'll also see is things like types of architecture that are similar to other cultures. That's just their types of architecture that they believe goes with those elements of culture. Okay, so you can see that with architecture as well. And then we have cultural hearth. Cultural hearth is talking about like the heart of a culture. This is the beginning of the culture, and this is where it has to spread. And there's different geographic areas that have different cultural hearths. Your different cultural hearths, same subheading, same number 3, cultural hearth. We're just adding geographic regions to this. This is the beginning of culture, basically. This is when culture first developed, was in these ancient river valley civilizations. I don't have them ranked in any particular order because we don't really know which one was first, because they didn't keep good records, really. Some of them kept records, but There's no dating system at this time period. We're talking about 15, 20,000 years ago. So there's no dating system, we're not sure, but we do know that this is where individual culture groups started to exist. The first is the Mesopotamia cultural hearth. This is in between the Tigris and Euphrates River in the Middle East, also known as the Fertile Crescent, but it's Mesopotamia, which means land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is one of the cultural hearths. Another one is in East Asia. You've got the Yangtze River and the Huanghe River in East Asia, which are in China. These are river valley civilizations that develop cultures and civilizations within this region. The other one is the Indus River Valley civilization, hence the Indus River. Okay, that's where this culture developed. Then you have the Nile River Valley civilization in Egypt, where kind of that culture developed. And then a new one for me that I've never heard of is the Aegean Sea culture, kind of your Greeks and Romans era, a little bit before that time period. But that's the area that we're looking at, and they're saying that this Aegean Sea was also a cultural hearth to different elements of culture. So these are the areas where culture first developed, and we first saw culture exist, and then they diffuse from this point. I got two more topics on concepts of culture. First is ethnocentrism and relativism. Ethnocentrism is the idea that my culture's best and I'm going to judge others. That's what it's looking at. So it's like comparing African culture to my culture, of American culture, and looking down upon them because of that comparison. It's totally taking yourself out, or you're keeping yourself in. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead. It's keeping yourself into the situation, meaning I think mine is best, and I'm going to look down, and I'm going to judge these other cultures based on mine. I am centering my thought process around my culture, and anything that's not mine is worse. The other type is cultural relativism, and this is when you are evaluating others. This one you are taking yourself out of the picture. What I mean by that is you're putting aside your own standards and you're evaluating the standards of others. So you're not thinking about your own culture when you're looking at other cultures. You're looking at their culture within itself. You're not judging. It's more of a fair way of looking at it. And a good word to associate with that is evaluating. That's what we're looking at with cultural relativism. And then the last I'm looking at is cultural differences. And I've got the idea of syncretism. Syncretism means it's the fusion of the old with the new. So the fusion of old ideas with the new ideas, and how that comes into play with different cultural differences. This is a good look at how and why cultures change, because you're seeing a fusion of ideas, a syncretism of ideas, not just necessarily old ideas of your own culture, but also ideas from other ones, and fusing your own to make it better.